This talk tonight is a part of this series that I'm doing is my collaboration with SARASAR Space in Tehran, in which we provide new paradigms and delve into contemporary ways of thinking about arts and architecture. There are two reasons that I'm doing this series of talks. Firstly, after reading Levi Bryan's book, Democracy of Object, he talks about Roy Bosker's classification of sort of objects. He talks about transient objects and intransient objects. Intransient objects are the ones that sort of gets their existence is not related to human existence, like gravity, like this table, this laptop. If the humanity goes extinct, these objects remain the same. They're not going to disappear suddenly. But then you have transient objects whose existence is in direct relation, or matter of fact, correlation with human beings, like culture, like language, and like arts. There is no art without humans. There is no culture without humans, and there is absolutely no language without humans who are familiarized or familiar with the grammar of that language. These objects can disappear. And all the things that these transient objects have in common is that they're dynamic. They change over time. We don't dress like we used to, like Iranians used to, like 200 years ago. We don't talk like them, and the culture is different. And I think it is different. It is important to talk about arts and aesthetics, which is also dynamic, which is also changing, if we want to be the true children of our time, and if we want to create something that is contemporary. And the other reason for sort of creating these talks is that the lack of any definition for aesthetics in Iran art scene and Iranian architectural scene. There is no definition, there is no discourse, to the extent that I heard from one of Iranian artist celebrities that said, there is no art object anymore, it's all a matter of presentation. It's all about how do you present your things inside of the white cube, and that's art, that's something that I really don't believe in. And in Iranian architectural scene, you also face this sort of trend that architects are trying to create this visually appealing structures or buildings, and then sort of projecting and imposing their ideas onto it, like projecting all the word salad onto it, as if it actually belongs to the building, which I think that's not the right way to sort of tackle any architectural questions, in fact. The reason I've invited Graham and Foster Gage is that they both have a genuine practice, one in philosophy and one in architecture and aesthetics. And for example, for Mark, it is not his architectural practice is not artificially created, but is rather has a deep ground in philosophy, matter of fact, in object-oriented philosophy, and is a byproduct of his way of thinking about life and the world. The same goes with Graham Harman as well. I'm gonna give a short introduction of Graham and Mark, and then we can start the talk. Since Mark is going first, I'm gonna introduce Mark Foster Gage. He is an architect and academic known for his innovative and avant-garde approach to architecture and design. He is the principal of the Mark Foster Gage Architects, firm based in New York City. Gage has gained recognition for his exploration of complex and visually striking architectural forms. Mark Foster Gage has been associated with the Yale School of Architecture, where he serves as an associate professor and has been involved in teaching architectural design. His work often involves the infusion of digital technology, materials, and aesthetics, pushing the boundaries of traditional architectural conventions. In 2016, he organized a symposium entitled Aesthetic Activism, At Yale University, the symposium explored emerging positions that cast aesthetics as the primary discourse for social, ecological, and political engagements. Graham Harman is a distinguished professor of philosophy at SARASAR and a prominent contemporary philosopher known for his influential contribution to speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. Harman is a key figure in the intersection of philosophy, metaphysics, aesthetics, and architecture. Central to his work is the proposition that objects possesses hidden within aspects that extend beyond any relation and correlation, challenging conventional anthropocentric perspectives. Harman's exploration of the nature of reality and the relationship between objects has left a lasting impact on contemporary philosophy through numerous books and articles, including titles like To Being and Architecture and Objects. He has shaped discussions on the profound nature of existence and the philosophy of objects. Thank you both for joining us tonight. The floor is yours, Mark.
All right. Thanks, Erfan, for the nice introduction. Nice to be here today. In the interest of kind of like keeping on topic in aesthetics and objects, I wanted to maybe just talk about what I've been, I guess, working on intellectually over the last couple of years. I mean, it's interesting. Graham and I have, I guess, probably had an open dialogue going on for 9 or 10 years at this point, and we've taught a studio together at Yale, a design studio. So that was an interesting way to kind of bring our worlds together through actual design with the students working on it for a semester. And I think maybe like how O got into architecture is pretty well documented. And maybe I want to talk about a little bit about what I think maybe the next chapter, like how we're moving on, or how things have changed, and where, I don't know, at least where I'm interested in going a little bit. And to give that, I'll just give a really brief background. So about 20 years ago, I was interested in teaching something about aesthetics at the Yale School of Architecture, but I've never received any formal training in philosophy. I didn't have any expertise in aesthetics. And when I went to look for books on the subject of aesthetics in architecture, I realized there hadn't really been any, except for maybe 1 or 2 written in the past century. It really was kind of cut off as an aspect of architectural education around World War I. And in my opinion, I think that's it's very unusual that architecture as a field wouldn't have a relationship with aesthetics, because if you ask anyone on the street, they would assume there's a relationship between architecture and aesthetics. Indeed, I would argue that most people perceive architectural aesthetically, not conceptually, which I think is probably something we all agree on. But there was no books on architecture and aesthetics, so I kind of set about reading a bunch of philosophy and just trying to pick out the parts that I think were germane to architecture. And over the course of about 10 years, I produced a book on aesthetic theory called Aesthetic Theory, Essential Text for Architecture and Design. And if I had to redo it, it would probably include a lot more text, but I think it was really the first shot across the bow of really trying to fuse these worlds in some way and cross this bridge. And it's interesting because I've gotten to speak to a lot of people like Graham within the worlds of philosophy and arts and curation. But I've noticed there's still this kind of like resistance, architects discussing aesthetics. There's a kind of, even though we've been working on this project for over a decade, there's still a kind of hesitation for architects even to speak about aesthetic subjects. So I have a new book coming out next month. It's a very small book called On the Appearance of the World. And I'll just kind of give a Cliff's Notes about what it's about. But it really starts with COVID. I got really stir crazy during COVID. I needed to get out of the house. I flew to San Francisco and bought a new motorcycle and drove to New York City on my motorcycle over about 3 weeks. And it was astounding at how ugly the United States has gotten over the last X amount of years. So I've been all over the world, except to Iran, which very much looking forward to going to someday. But the thing that really astounded me was, and it seems like an obvious relationship, like architects stopped discussing aesthetics around 1920, and then we have a century of cities to 2020. And when you drive through those cities, they're all hideously ugly and inhumane places to exist. And when I was driving across country, I got a different perspective on that because usually when I fly to LA to do something, you fly over all of the places in the United States, all the 20th century cities, you know? And I was just, it was just staggering to me how ugly our built environment had become. That the United States is mostly a collection of strip malls and suburbs, and there's really no aesthetic intelligence given either to the planning or the individual objects. And it's just kind of like a smudge of this, it's just economic development that's really annihilated the concept of the city. And I found that really profoundly depressing. And I really started thinking with the free time I had during COVID, why is this? And I started thinking about the ways architects think about aesthetics. And I came up with four or five, and that's what this book is called On the Appearance of the World. So I'm going to give you these four or five attitudes that I think architecture has towards aesthetics, just as a way for me to kind of categorize like what's going wrong. And so one of them is the anti-aesthetic. And the anti-aesthetic is basically this belief that aesthetics are somehow only used by people in power to control the masses. That the idea that aesthetics are somehow this tool of omnipotent control, and that architects need to stay away from aesthetics because they're elite and they're about control and they're sinister. And that's really still a kind of pervasive attitude in architecture schools, in particular, I would say in older generations of architectural professors. And I think that comes to some degree out of a total commitment to Marxism, that there's somehow aesthetics is a tool of oppression. And I think that's still really an active, maybe an active belief in architecture schools by a certain number of people. There's another group that I would call, so that's anti-aesthetic. The next group is called the suppressed aesthetic. And I think those are architects that work aesthetically, but present their work using non-aesthetic criteria. And I would say one of the great examples of this is someone like Graham Harman, who, if you think of the CCTV tower, which is, you know, basically like two giant cantilevers that meet in the middle, the way he presents that project is as if it was inevitable. Like I studied the program and the program had to connect in a certain way, and therefore the building had to look like this. I didn't want it to look like that. It wasn't an aesthetic choice. It's just the program that made me do it. But we all know that's not true, right? The program doesn't make you do a building with $1 billion cantilever. It's this kind of attitude, and I talk about it in the book, where they pretend there's a kind of a pretending that you're not interested in aesthetics, but still using aesthetics to design your building, and then couching it in other things like, I don't know, sustainability is a big one, or zoning envelopes. So, you know, I took the kind of Bjarke Ingels strategy. You know, I have it to do a building in New York City, and the zoning envelope is like this. So I shave off the building to match the zoning envelope. And don't judge me, I didn't do it. The zoning envelope didn't. I didn't make any decisions. It's not aesthetic. It's just the inevitable result of me carefully studying the program produces this super weird building. And it's kind of what students do as well. I think a lot of students in architecture schools will design something aesthetically, but say, oh no, it's this reason because of X, Y, Z. And it's like there's a desire to do maybe even a beautiful building, but you would never be allowed to say that in a final review. Say, well, my goal was to produce a beautiful building. You can say this is my building and it looks this way because of these particular things, which are real calculable data points. Like you can't criticize me because I didn't do it. So there's the anti-aesthetic, there's the suppressed aesthetic. I would say there's a kind of communicatory aesthetic which is something I was speaking with Erfan a little earlier, which is where the architect believes they have a specific idea that they need to infuse into the building. And the only right way to build it, read the building, is through that infused idea. And a good example of this is someone like Santiago Calatrava, who at the like our World Trade Center Transit Center, he designed it supposedly to look like a dove being released from the hands of the child, because it was about peace and it was about speed and transit. And sure enough, he presents this as if it's this, you know, the building is the dove. And if you go on a tour of this building, all the tour guides will tell you the building is a dove being released from the hands of a child. So there's supposedly only this one way to read it, that it's like usually a simple, stupid metaphor, or you do a building in the mountains and it's supposed to look like the mountains. So Daniel Libeskind did the Denver Art Museum, and his whole pitch was like, it's angular, but it's angular because mountains are angular and it's close to the mountains, which are over here. So there's this like single top-down idea that justifies the building and makes it really easy to understand. And once you understand a building like that, like, oh, I get it, it's supposed to be a dove, you don't have to ask any other questions because you already understand the building. It kind of shuts down curiosity, it shuts down inquiry. But, there's some aesthetic ambition there. If Santiago Calatrava wants the building to look like a bird, then aesthetically he gives the building these big giant wings and it looks like a bird. So we have an anti-aesthetic agenda. We have a kind of secret, suppressed aesthetic agenda. We have a communicatory aesthetic agenda, which is this top-down reading of a building. And then we get back into kind of a more historic position, which is a formalist aesthetics, which is essentially the form of the building is not intended to be linked to any particular message, but produces certain effects either in reality or in the, I would say, emotional state of the viewer. And the more I've read about critiques of aesthetics in architecture, the more I realize this is a problem. And the problem is that formalism is being conflated with a kind of hedonism. And hedonism is that you're basically doing something just for pleasure. That formalism, it's like I'm designing this building just for the pleasure of seeing this building. I don't care about the world. I don't care about sustainability. It's only for this hedonistic principles of like consuming the building. It's just about selling the building. It's just about participating in capitalism. It's just about something vulgar. And even the word hedonism, which is, I mean, Graham can give us a kind of better background on the philosophical basis of hedonism, but I think that's what people understand formalism in architecture to be, a type of hedonism, that you're just doing it for visual pleasure and it doesn't have any other ambitions in terms of culture and society. And I'm thinking about how architecture can maybe not fall into any one of those previous traps that I've laid, but think about how aesthetics can be something that maybe isn't intended to provide a specific message. You don't have to be secret about having an aesthetic agenda, but maybe you want a building to produce more than just pleasure. Like maybe you want a building to produce a humane and just area to live, a beautiful environment in which humans can thrive. And so architecture doesn't necessarily need to carry a specific message, and it doesn't only have to be about vulgar, the pursuit of pleasure, but there can be like, I don't know, it's going to sound really cheesy, but when you go to a restaurant, you can tell if the chef cared about how they plated the food and wanted you to enjoy it. That if you go to some restaurants, they just scoop a bunch of lasagna and throw it on a plate. But in some restaurants, they take care to kind of care for how you put the food on the plate. And there's a kind of effort of care that goes into certain types of dining. And the food may taste better or not, but based on how the food is presented, you know if love or care has gone into it. And I think there might be a version of that in architecture, and it might be through aesthetics, that you can read in a building whether it was built with the intention of care, or maybe an aesthetics of care, or an aesthetics of a kind of almost like a new humanism, maybe, that it's not just the result of the pursuit of profit. It's not the result of ego and personal aggrandizement. It's not the result of um, any of the other types of aesthetic agendas, but that there's got to be a way that architects have the freedom to design using aesthetic criteria that aren't nefarious, that don't require a single message like a bird, but also aren't interpreted as just pure unadulterated pleasure. And I'm, for lack of a better term, thinking of this as like a type of speculative aesthetics, that you're kind of doing something with care and intent, with the desire that it produce a humane and livable environment in which humans can grow and thrive. And that is something that's transmissible through architecture in the same way that you would transmit that message through caring about how you plate food at a restaurant. And I think that there's that ability to care for society that doesn't have to come through a one-liner that's missing in architecture. And instead of us reading architects caring about aesthetics as a message of grabbing pleasure, if we can reread it as the ambition to produce something with care, then I think we can kind of maybe retool the way architects think of aesthetics, the way that's not something evil, but it's not something like a one-liner, and it's not something that's vulgar and capitalistic. The only So what's tricky is, like, how do you convince people of this, that it's funny. It's like you would never go into it like I don't know, if you speak with a composer, you'd never have to, well, I don't know, maybe this isn't true, but architecture seems to be one of the only creative professions where you're not allowed to want to produce something that's beautiful. That you're not allowed to want something that people are interested in visually. And I've been using Graham's work quite a bit for the last decade to think about different ways of arranging architecture and form to produce different effects in the viewers, and that those effects aren't intended just to be for vulgar pleasure, but they're intended to entice a kind of curiosity. I've been working with thinking about, initially 10 years ago, thinking about collections of objects and thinking of architecture at higher levels of resolution, that architecture isn't something you can just read in one instant, but it draws you in through resolution. In that sense, it's withdrawn, that there's more to it than meets the eye. There's more to it than just calling it a bird. And I've gone through several iterations of, I don't know, trying to do this in my practice. And I'm going to show maybe 3 projects here pretty quickly that think about how these ideas come together. So I would say maybe 5 or 10 years ago, I was really interested in high resolution. And there's a lot of this work on our website, thinking, like I said, about how to bring together a lot of detail so that the building looks very different from far away than it looks up close up, that it draws you in. Right now, I'm thinking about how architecture can do that, not with necessarily separate objects, but by combining different typologies in architecture to create new topologies. And it's something that Graham talks about in his immaterialism book, how an object can combine with other objects multiple times to produce new things, right? So I was tell my students, just using this idea that comes out in his immaterialism book, that, I went to Yale as a graduate student, and there was Mark Gage before Yale, and then there was Mark Gage plus Yale, and that produced a certain new type of Mark Gage, that you can combine any two things to produce a new thing. And how can we do that? How can I do that in architecture now with typology in a way that I used to be doing with objects? So I'm going to spin through a couple buildings here. I'm going to go through 3. The first is March or so. So please, again, don't like post those anywhere or take any photos. But yeah, hopefully you'll see the big release when they're when they're announced publicly in a month or so.
Great.
Okay,
Thank
turn
you
it
so
over
much,
back
Mark.
to you, Erfan.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Graham?
That's a tough act to follow, but that's why I always like interacting with Mark and Erfan as well, by the way. That was aesthetically challenging. And that wasn't a euphemism. It was aesthetically challenging, all in the good sense. Yes, we agree on a large number of things here concerning the relation between aesthetics and politics. So since I'm going to say a number of negative things about the political focus on art and architecture, let me begin by saying Mark and I both sympathize with any number of leftist causes. In fact, I've seen Mark risk violent treatment from the New York police in a video during the protests about the murder of George Floyd. So Mark has put his physical safety on the line in at least some cases for this stuff.
Yeah, I should mention that like politically, like citizenship is as important as architecture in terms of like how I think we engage politics. And I think you engage politics as a human. Maybe, anyways, maybe that's something you discuss, but yeah, that architecture's political influence isn't necessarily what people think it is always,
Right.
But carry
That's
on.
right.
Yeah.
That said, the left, at least in the United States and some other Western countries, is becoming the new Christianity in the sense that people adopt a leftist position to say you haven't saved your soul if your work doesn't somehow redeem the oppressed and exploited of the earth. So there becomes kind of a moralistic bottom line that's often kind of humorless, that's used to attack everything in sight, and it becomes a kind of moral high ground that people can stand on and not have to do any other work. They can simply denounce the others around them. I'm going to paint a picture that shows aesthetics as being more important to human life than that. I'm going to start with a funny remark by Slavoj Žižek, where he talked about how, and I've noticed this, I've been in an architecture school for 8 years now, SciArc. I don't think I've ever heard beauty mentioned once unless I brought it up. And I've noticed this in the art world for decades, of course, that you can't talk about beauty. That's considered a very clumsy and naive thing to talk about, at least in the Western world. And Zizek makes the funny remark that the roles of aesthetics and scientific knowledge have reversed in this respect. Where you're going to find beauty is in popular science books like Brian Greene's The Elegant Universe, a book about string theory. If you read The Double Helix by James Watson about the discovery of the structure of DNA, there's a line where he says that Crick and I knew that the structure was too beautiful not to be the real one. And then where you really find it is in mathematics, where mathematicians speak with no shame at all about beauty. In fact, they talk in the mathematical world about certain proofs. That proof is from the book. What does the book mean? The book means that, as they say, God has a book not only of all the true proofs in mathematics, but of the most beautiful possible proofs for each theorem. And so, for instance, the famous solution of Fermat's last theorem in 1993, it works, but that obviously doesn't belong in the book because it takes hundreds of pages in amazing detours to show it. Whereas Fermat, if he was right, said it's just a little too long to write this proof in the margin of my book, so I can't do it. So Fermat must have had a much more elegant proof. So that's what you find in mathematics and the natural sciences, this respect for beauty. What you find in the arts instead is more often Damien Hirst takes the carcass of a dead cow, puts it in a gallery, lets the flies come into the carcass and be electrocuted by wires he's put in. So art has kind of taken over the function of brute reality rather than of beauty. And we can trace this back probably to Duchamp's hatred of what he called retinal art, and that art is somehow supposed to make you think, which was a direct challenge to the Kantian tradition. The Kantian tradition, Kant being probably, I would say, still the most important aesthetician since his time. For Kant, you're supposed to use taste. An artwork is not supposed to be exchangeable with any sort of conceptual meditation or conceptual meaning. And you could say maybe it's dying a little, but Duchamp still really is very much still the standard hero of the arts today. And there's shortcomings to that. I'm more of a formalist at heart, and I'm glad Mark in his anthology, which I teach every spring, has included a number of important formalist texts. Essentially, you could say that in a way, aesthetics today is either Kantian or Hegelian. Whereas for Kant, the artwork is cut off from everything else. For Hegel, the artwork is a crystallization of all the historical forces surrounding it. And of course, that's more appealing to the left because it allows it to bring in the workings of capital and oppression and so forth. But I want to look at this problem of beauty and say I agree with Mark that America is incredibly ugly. Why does it have to be so ugly? There's a few cities that are pleasing. We have a lot of beautiful nature in this country, but no aesthetic care whatsoever is put into the design of our lived space. And in education, the emphasis is all the more on STEM subjects, less on aesthetics as time goes by. So it's not going to get better unless something really changes. A lot of times people talk about beauty and ugliness, or the beautiful and the ugly, as opposites. I want to say instead that the opposite of the beautiful is the literal. Now, the literal is not something evil for me. The literal for me is when you identify an object either with its subcomponents or with its outer effects. I sometimes call these undermining and overmining in philosophical. So there are really only two kinds of knowledge. If somebody asks you what something is, like what's water, you can tell them it's H2O, or you can tell them what it does. It quenches thirst, it puts out fires, et cetera, et cetera. And those are both useful answers. We need knowledge. Humans need knowledge to survive. But those are literal knowledge because you are identifying a thing with something else. You're either identifying it with its pieces or you're identifying it with its outer effects. You are identifying a thing with what can be known about it. The problem with that is that a thing is more than its components, as we all know. You put H2O together, hydrogen and oxygen both are fuel for fire. H2O puts out fire. So obviously something happens that we call emergent. Something happens when you put the two H's and the O together that is not in the H or the O taken individually. So knowledge misses emergence quite often. And when you reduce a thing to what it does, you're missing out on all its possible uses that are not being conceived. You're missing out on all the aspects of a thing that are not expressed, that might never be expressed. You're missing out on the autonomy of the thing, the fact that a thing is what it is and is not just what it does. So we're looking, in other words, for a midway point between a thing's components and its effects. And this is what reality is for me. Reality is not what happens. What happens is kind of an exaggeration or an abstraction from reality because everything that could happen doesn't happen. The ingredients of reality are never fully exposed in all the events that happen. And aesthetics is the best tool we have for hinting at or indicating that layer of reality. I also want to start by saying philosophy is supposed to do this as well. We've made the mistake in the last 400 years of aspiring for philosophy to be a kind of science. This happens in analytic philosophy. This happens in continental philosophy in the form of phenomenology as rigorous science. This idea that philosophy is simply a different kind of knowing. The problem with that is that if you go back to our ancestral hero Socrates in philosophy, and even go back to the meaning of the Greek word philosophia, it doesn't mean wisdom, it means love of wisdom. It's a love of wisdom that no one can ever obtain. It's a kind of searching for lures. People remember that in Plato's dialogues, Socrates is always asking questions such as what is love, what is friendship, what is virtue, what is justice? But it's often forgotten that he never attains any answers to those questions. Everyone's left maybe a little closer to the truth, but somewhat at a loss to define anything by the end of all the dialogues. And so this is what Socrates is. Socrates is not a man of knowledge. Socrates is a man of eros. If eros means loving something that you can never fully possess, which all love is. Reaching out to something that recedes from you or withdraws from you in Heidegger's terms. So how does aesthetics do this? Well, there are two ways in which we over-literalize the world. The most famous one is the one where we think that a thing is simply its appearance to us. Right? That if we approach a thing with the proper scientific method or the proper intellectual tools, its essence can become directly visible to us. Natural science often makes this claim. Mathematics certainly makes this claim. And phenomenology makes this claim on the continental side. The idea that if you simply follow the right phenomenological procedures, you can intuit the essence of objects. You can see what the essence of a chair or mailbox really is. Well, that's the main form of literalism that we're concerned about. There's some antidote to that in Kant's thing in itself, which is not very popular, but it was his great insight. This idea that we can never know the things in themselves because we are confined to human cognition. We are confined to the fact that humans see things in terms of cause and effect, in terms of space and time. We cannot know for sure that that is the way things really are. We can simply make transcendental statements about the human conditions of knowing the world. Heidegger also has a bit of this in him. As opposed to Husserl, who thinks we can know the essence of things. For Heidegger, his great rebellious students, the essence of things is sometimes revealed historically, and it's never revealed entirely. And of course, Heidegger had a high regard for poetic language, religious discourse, and other forms of indirect access to the real. Very unpopular now because Zizek and Badiou, the two leading still alive continental philosophers, are very opposed to this. They come instead from a Hegelian background, which also is suspicious of mystery, suspicious of the idea that there's something residual that reason cannot grasp if it follows through the dialectic. But there's a second form of non-literalization that I think is even more important, and this comes from Husserl against the British tradition of David Hume. And this is the part of Triple O that people always forget and never talk about. They simply try to critique Triple O for being too Kantian and thinking there are things in themselves. But that's only half of the discourse. The other half is that David Hume, you may recall, if you've studied philosophy, David Hume said there are no such thing as objects. There are bundles of qualities. If you hold an apple in your hand, apple is really just the nickname. It's an abbreviation or a list of all the true properties that exist pertaining to apples, such as red, round, hard, juicy, cold, tart. All of these things, all of these qualities coming together so often that we assume, or Hume assumes, that they must be something there binding them together, even though we have no direct access to these objects. So really all there are qualities. Qualities are what we perceive. We kind of lump them together in a lazy way when really all we ever encounter are the qualities. And this tradition continued. This was a very effective doctrine with a kind of subtle influence over thinkers, so that even someone like Brentano, who was Husserl's teacher, assumes the truth of this as well. He says, all experience boils down to content. That I experience an apple, that means I experience a specific red, a specific roundness, a specific hardness, and so on. Which implies that if one tiny bit of one of those qualities changes, we're actually not dealing with the same apple anymore, because an apple is nothing more than a bundle of qualities. And so if I take a bite out of the apple, it's not really the same apple anymore. If I rotate it 10 degrees, it's not really the same apple anymore, because it's displaying different qualities. Now, what Husserl discovered, and which is really the basis of phenomenology, is the idea that this isn't how consciousness works. We intend objects, that's his technical term. I perceive, I judge, I interact with objects in many different ways, and I realize that it's the same object even as its qualities vary over time. This is in fact how Husserl gets at the essence of an object in his philosophy. He asks you to imagine different possible variations of a thing, seeing it in different contexts, and imagining which parts of it cannot be varied without changing it. So there are certain things about the apple that we can't change without it not being an apple anymore. Husserl thinks we can reach those using the intellect, not using the senses. My view is that the intellect is no better than the senses at this, that there's a certain vagueness in what exactly it would take for us to say, oh, I was wrong, it wasn't an apple, it was a lemon. Which lines cannot be crossed for the apple to no longer be this particular apple? In other words, for Triple O, the philosophy I defend, there is always a tension between an object and its qualities. An object is never entirely identical with its qualities. It has a loose relationship with its own qualities. And there are a number of very interesting examples of this. One of them is the common phenomenon in history of the sinner become the saint. So in Christianity, there's St. Paul, who was persecuting and actually killing Christians. And then on the road to Damascus, he heard a voice from the heavens saying, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Converted to Christianity and became the leading apostle of the religion, spreading it around the Mediterranean. So here's a very powerful and zealous personality, kind of an extremist religious personality. He simply changed the terms of the religion from zealous Judaism to zealous Christianity. But you're not going to say that it's a different person, even though he changed his name from Saul to Paul. He's a very good example of someone where the invariant aspect of his personality was something like intensity, maybe a certain dogmatism. That's what characterized the essence of Paul, not the fact that he was a Jewish zealot and later a Christian zealot. Those are fleeting aspects of his character that appeared at different times in history. I put this idea forth myself in terms of literary criticism, that one of the ways to understand a literary work, and this could work for an architectural or visual artwork as well, is to imagine counterfactual changes to an artwork. How would you ruin an art? What could you do to ruin an artwork? What's the smallest number of steps you could do to ruin a particular artwork or architectural work? Can you think of anything that might improve it? So for instance, I looked at a story by H.P. Lovecraft, the American horror and science fiction writer I've written a book about. And one of his stories, The Whisperer in Darkness, I think is one of my favorite, but I can't stand the first paragraph. If I had known Lovecraft personally, I would have urged him to delete the first paragraph and begin matter-of-factly with the second paragraph. The first paragraph is, it's what they call in medias res, where you're plunging the reader into the middle of something where they don't know what's going on, and the narrator is saying something like, I swear I didn't run out of that room for the reason you think. I swear that I didn't hear the voice before I ran out. I ran out before. And so you're confused for a paragraph, wondering what's going on. Whereas the second paragraph begins, the matter began, as far as I was concerned, in the spring of 1927, which is a kind of horrifyingly matter-of-fact way to talk about the fact that people saw dead alien bodies floating down a river from some caves in Vermont. You can do this with any object. What's a way to make it better? What's a way to make it worse? Which implies that an object is not the same as its qualities. You subtract from its qualities, or you can add qualities to it. The essence of the object is something a little deeper than that. How do you get at the core of a thing and what it really is? And for me, this is what aesthetics is really about. Aesthetics is about driving a wedge between an object and its qualities, whereas literalism is about identifying an object with its qualities. So when we normally think of science, we think of normal science in Thomas Kuhn's sense, what 90% of scientists do is they're solving puzzles, according to Kuhn. But I would rather say that they are discovering new qualities that belong to a thing. They're discovering new properties. They're studying a given virus, right? They're learning. I just read an article this morning about the use of bacteriophages, viruses that eat bacteria, because we have so many super bugs now, super germs, through the overuse of antibiotics. So many people are getting infections that can't be stopped with antibiotics. There's, in particular, in the United States, there's a brand of over-the-counter eye drops that were first reported last year. A lot of people are going blind from them or dying from them because they contain bacteria that are attacking the eyes and sometimes attacking other parts of the body. And so now this new creative strategy, medical strategy that's been devised is they're building up a library of phages, viruses that destroy and eat bacteria. And they're building up a library so they can know which phages are best for killing which bacteria. So what they're doing is they're trying to discover new properties of all these phages. Which kinds of superbugs can be killed by these particular phages? Or if you're doing astronomy, you're trying to find out new qualities about Jupiter's moon Io. I just posted a picture on Facebook. Jupiter's moon Io has the most volcanoes on the surface of anybody in the solar system. And I don't know when that was discovered, but it wasn't that long ago. And we're discovering new exoplanets, planets orbiting stars every week. And so that's what science is usually thought of as doing. It's attributing new qualities to objects whose existence is already known. Now, for me, the importance of Thomas Kuhn in the philosophy of science, it's not what people usually think. People usually think, oh, there's a paradigm shift for Kuhn. That means science isn't objective. It's done sociologically because suddenly society converts, like a religious conversion, to believing in one kind of object rather than another. Instead, if you read Kuhn closely, what he's telling us is that often the object and its qualities are not discovered at the same time. That at first, when a scientific discovery is made, usually it's seen as having discovered a few anomalous qualities of an object we've already known. And this is why it's hard to know when an object was discovered in science. He gives two really brilliant examples. One of them has to do with the discovery of oxygen somewhere in the late 1700s. We can't say exactly when it happened because you could either say Priestley in England discovered it or Lavoisier in France discovered it. The reason you can't see either of those is because neither of them knew exactly what they were looking at. Both of them wrongly identified oxygen with something else. Priestley thought it was nitrous oxide, and Lavoisier thought it was the entire air. And of course, they're both wrong. They understood some qualities of oxygen at first, but it took quite a while for them to understand there was a new object, oxygen. But there's an even clearer example. Who discovered quantum theory and when? Well, we generally say Max Planck discovered quantum theory, and we generally say that was in 1900s with Planck's solution of the so-called black body radiation problem. If you have a black oven with a tiny slit that emits energy, and these don't exist, you can't make a perfect black oven that absorbs all radiation. It's an ideal object. The problem with it is if you try to calculate how much energy comes out of this oven, the answers were always infinity, an infinite amount of energy is coming out, which is impossible because it would melt the oven, it would melt the universe. There can't be an infinity of energy in one oven. And so Planck came up originally with what was just a mathematical solution to the problem, which is that if you assume mathematically that heat must come in certain quantities, it can't just come in any amount. It must come in either 1 unit of heat, 2 units of heat, 3 units of heat, 4 units of heat. It can't be halfway or decimals involved. Then you can solve the problem mathematically. It's a mathematical trick. Planck did not initially believe that nature itself was made of quanta, made of tiniest units, because he was a fairly mainstream conservative physicist. It wasn't until 1909, after some objections from Einstein and Paul Ehrenfest, that he realized that these must exist in nature. There must be objects in nature called quanta. So the object took 9 years to be discovered after the anomalous qualities were discovered. So you have this 9-year gap where there's this ambiguity, and Kuhn showed that this is the rule rather than the exception during scientific revolutions. There is a gap between the object itself and its qualities. And if you like reading history of science as much as I do, what you'll find is during periods of scientific revolution, they become almost like art movements. The scientists almost start talking and thinking like artists. They're using intuition, they're using thought experiments, they're arguing over basics. They're not doing concentrated, detailed lab work the way we normally think of scientists as doing. They're thinking like philosophers and artists. And this is an example of the aesthetic effect happening in the sciences. Anytime a revolution happens, you're going to see that gap emerge between an object and its qualities. But we can look at other examples. One example I often give, such as in my book from Pelican, I don't think that one's in Persian yet, but it might be, it's going to be, I think. Or maybe it is. I lost track of which books I have in Persian. I talked about the difference between metaphorical and literal discourse, and there are 2 major differences between metaphorical and literal discourse, at least. The first of them is that literal discourse is trying to strike as close to the mark as possible. So if you ask me what the number pi is, and I say 3.14, that's okay, but a better answer will be 3.14159, and an even better answer will be 3.141592653.7. And that's as far as I have it memorized from high school, but you can never end that, right? Pi is an irrational number. You can never reach the final digit in the series. But the goal is asymptotically to approach closer and closer to the true number pi by giving as many numbers as you can. And for most purposes, 10 digits is probably more than enough, maybe even less. So literal discourse is trying to get as close to the truth as possible. Metaphorical discourse is trying to get neither too close to the truth nor too far from the truth. So the example that I often use is if I say a pen is like a pencil, you would never think of that as a metaphorical statement in any but the most contrived Dadaist cases. There's no way anyone would see a pen is like a pencil as a metaphorical statement. Why? Because you're immediately focused on the qualities they share in common. They are both long, skinny objects that make dark marks on paper and enable you to write. They're both pretty cheap. They're both held in the same way, and so on. Pen is like a pencil, not metaphorical. Now, what if I go to the opposite extreme and say a pen is like a milkshake? It's hard to make a metaphor out of that one because it's too remote. It's too unconvincing. Where if I say the pen is mightier than the sword, a kind of cliche metaphor in English, but it's still a fairly powerful one. The pen is mightier than the sword. Well, I'm putting the pen and the sword in a comparison where they at least belong in the same field of strong objects that can slay enemies. And just the pen is actually stronger than a sword. You need for metaphors to be somewhere in between, too close or too far. That differentiates it from literal statements. But there's another one that's maybe even more interesting, which is that literal statements are reversible. Metaphors are not. So a pen is like a pencil is like a pen. There's no difference. It doesn't matter which you put first. It doesn't matter because all you're doing is comparing qualities. With metaphors, it matters because in metaphors, the 2 terms don't play the same role. One plays the subject role or the object role, sorry, the other plays the qualities role. So in Western literature, our most famous example is Homer's wine dark sea in the Odyssey. Odysseus is sailing home over the wine dark sea. Well, what you're saying there is that there's a sea with wine qualities. If I were to speak instead of a sea dark wine, then you're talking about a wine with sea qualities. which is also a metaphor, but it's not the same metaphor. It's a totally different object that's been created. What that tells us is that when you say wine dark sea, sea is playing the role of object, wine is playing the role of the qualities. We have some idea of what wine qualities are like. They generate intoxication, they have a certain color, there's a certain danger, therefore wine is forbidden in some societies, and so on. It has to be aged a certain amount of time to be consumed. We don't quite know what a sea would be that is wine-like. And so that sea that is wine-like withdraws from us. The wine qualities are there before the mind. That's not hard. But the sea withdraws from us. And what that means is that the sea is not there before us, which means we have to perform it. And this is the third interesting feature of metaphorical statements that differentiates them from literal statements, which is that we have to perform the metaphorical statement. It takes work in your mind to imagine the wine dark sea in a way that it doesn't take work when you say a pen is like a pencil. Pen is like a pencil is a statement you make from the outside as an objective observer. You might be wrong at most, but you are standing outside the pen and the pencil when you do that. When you try to experience the wine dark sea, you are like a performance artist performing that in your mind, which is not something that literal statements do. It's not something we normally think of knowledge as doing. We think of knowledge as separated from the subjective human factor, whereas aesthetics requires a human response. If you hear the wine dark sea and it does nothing for you aesthetically, then the aesthetic object does not exist. Your actual participation is required. There's a famous artwork done by Joseph Beuys, the German performance artist, called I Like America and America Likes Me. I believe he flew to America for the first time in his life just to perform this work and then left America immediately after, which is kind of funny side aspect. But it involved letting a coyote run through the art museum, I believe in Philadelphia. And then you were watching the video of the coyote running past all these paintings. The poor coyote is very confused. Why am I locked in an art museum? And you can see pretty well that the coyote does not experience these paintings as artworks. And so the aesthetic effect is for us, the viewers who see this coyote running through the museum, not for the coyote itself. And this is where I differentiate myself from Tristan Garcia. Tristan Garcia thinks an artwork is an artwork, whether or not anyone is there. I don't think that at all. I think the human beholder is just as much an ingredient of a painting as the paint is. It's a hybrid object. And this is important because this puts O at odds with the whole of the Kantian tradition, which it otherwise accepts. Let's talk about Kant for a second. Kant thinks of the artwork as autonomous. Kant thinks of the artwork as something distinct from the human who observes it, even though there's this complicating factor that Kant's less interested in the artworks than he is in the structure of universal human judgment that allows us to understand works. But let's forget about that for a second. Kant doesn't want you to like artworks just because they're agreeable. So I come from Iowa, obscure Midwestern state in the United States. So I'm inclined to appreciate any novels or television shows set in Iowa. But if I'm judging those works, I need to put that to one side. And actually, Mark's my neighbor. He's from Nebraska. We're both from obscure Midwestern states. But Field of Dreams, a famous, charming American baseball movie set in Iowa, close to where I grew up. I have to be careful when I judge that film because it's kind of a harmless, delightful film. It's not a cinematic masterpiece. But if I were to call it a cinematic masterpiece, you'd suspect me probably of excessive Iowa patriotism. You're supposed to stand back and be disinterested for Kant as an aesthetic observer. This is the key. And Michael Fried, one of the great Kantian art critics of the 20th century, he might reject that label, but I call him a Kantian art critic because what Fried is most interested in is rejecting theatricality in art. And what he means about rejecting theatricality is that the artwork is not supposed to be appealing to us to try to get a reaction out of us. That's what he means by theater. And he says the paintings he really likes, especially in the 18th century, actually actively exclude us. So, for example, you might get a painting of a boy blowing a soap bubble. He's concentrating so hard on blowing the soap bubble that he's not paying any attention to us at all. That's emphasized, that we are excluded from the painting. The fact that somebody might be building a house of cards, also a very difficult, stressful pastime, that means that they're excluding us as viewers. Everybody listening very intently to St. Augustine preaching a sermon in the church. It's another example. All right, but to Fried's credit, he realizes that this already starts to break down, even in the 18th century. There's a famous painting by Jacques-Louis David, the great French painter of the French Revolution, called The Oath of the Horatii, where several men are swearing an oath with swords that they're going to fight to the death for something. And the women of the family are on the side of the painting, weeping, crying, because they're worried that the men are going to be killed in this dangerous undertaking. Now, on the one hand, the characters in the painting, the figures are all absorbed in what they're doing, and so that excludes us. But on the other hand, everyone's being drama queens in the painting, right? How often do you make an oath with a sword in your life? How often do you sit crying uncontrollably? These are fairly rare events, and they're designed in such a way to gain a lot of attention. And so then, as Fried goes through his historical trilogy following the history of French painting, he ends up reversing and saying, actually, what happens in French painting is painters are painting themselves into the paintings, like Courbet. You can see traces of Courbet putting himself in his paintings. And then finally, you get to Manet, considered even by Fried to be the first modern painter in the West, 1860s, where Manet usually has a figure in the center of the painting who's staring right at you. So there's no question of excluding the viewer. Often these are naked women as well. So it's very theatrical. What could be more theatrical than a naked woman sitting in the painting staring right at you? And the reason Fried didn't like theater is he didn't like the trends of 1960s art. He was kind of an old high modernist from the late 40s and 50s. He liked Jackson Pollock and other abstract expressionists. He didn't like the theatrical direction of 1960s art, which is still with us. The idea that you performance, or in the case of minimalism, he thought, what's the point of putting a naked white cube in a room except to provoke some emotional reaction in us? In any case, when I wrote on Fried and Art and Objects, my conclusion was that there is no way to have an artwork without a beholder theatrically invested in it, because that's what aesthetic is. What I said about the metaphor, you have to be involved in performing the metaphor. You have to be intimately involved in experiencing aesthetics in a way that you don't with literal statements. This gains further confirmation in philosophy from what we call speech act theory that some of you may know. Speech act theory, the most famous member is John Austin, analytic philosopher, and then Derrida wrote some things against him, and John Searle defended Austin against Derrida. But anyway, the idea that there's a distinction between constitutive statements, which merely report information, such as a pen is like a pencil, or the temperature in Los Angeles today is 28 degrees Celsius, and then performative statements that affect you as the person making them, such as I promise to tell you accurately the temperature of Los Angeles. Because if I say that, this means I am putting my reputation on the line as a truthful person, as a person who shares relevant facts, and as a reliable information source. Or if I promise someone something even more important than that and then break a promise, there can be severe consequences. And so in a performative statement, you are making yourself an ingredient of the proposition in a way that is not always true not usually true of constitutive statements, statements that are merely literal, that merely transmit information about an object having qualities. Los Angeles is the object, the qualities is 28 degrees today. So that's one thing about aesthetics that's important. It invests us in the reality in a way that literal statements do not. And this goes a long way toward explaining the refreshing and restorative quality of aesthetics by comparison with the ugly cities Mark Foster Gage saw on his motorcycle across America. When I looked at his projects just now, as happens when I look at all of his work, I felt refreshed. I felt that something new had burst into the world with his two resorts and also with his house. I'd love to have the house myself if I had the funds to build it and the property, but I will certainly try to visit those resorts when they open. Mark does fresh things, and he also, unlike many, understands the power of aesthetics and our experience of the built environment. And he's willing to do so with humor quite often, as with the New York skyscraper on the cover of that book in Iran that he mentioned. Right, so that's one thing. And then to go back to literalism again, a non-literal statement ascribes qualities to a thing of a sort that it usually doesn't have. And so you're seeing in Mark's projects there a number of qualities that you don't usually associate with buildings, including with resorts, such as the bridge extending over that little bay, or whatever it is, a pond, the inlet leading into that pond, and the use that is made of its cantilevered position over the water, the fact that you can look down and see the coral or look up and see the skylights. You may have had some precedents for that, but I've never seen anything like that. So I think that was a wonderful new capitalization. People won't like that word, but capitalization on the opportunities presented by that environment, that specific situation. And I'm sure your clients must have loved that as well too, since the projects were accepted. A couple of other analogies to, I've lost track of time. How am I doing, Erfan?
Can I have like 10 more minutes?
Okay. I also want to point out that Mark mentioned magic tricks, that magic tricks are often ruined once you know too much about how they were done. And that's another good example. The way to ruin a magic trick is to literalize it, to say, okay, that looked like something magical happened, but what really happened is the hat had a false bottom in it. And while you weren't looking, well, I made a joke about the usher in the back, I changed the two hats, and the other hat had a rabbit in the bottom. But since you weren't paying attention, you thought a rabbit magically appeared out of the hat. Okay, well, these are the tricks that magicians know and they share with each other. But there's an ironclad rule among magicians that you never share those tricks with non-magicians, right? And so you literalize a magic trick, you ruin it. Whereas you literalize a disease, you save lives. It's a good thing to literalize a disease. Or if you literalize witches and say there aren't really witches, there are just middle-aged women who are unmarried who are being made scapegoats for other problems in society, and so they're being burned alive, that's a socially good thing to do, to debunk a superstition. So there are cases where literalizing is a good thing. All cases involving knowledge, literalizing is a good thing. But in cases involving aesthetics, of which magic is one, you don't want stuff literalized. You want the illusion to be there. You want the illusion there in aesthetics. There's a club nearby where I live, and Jay Leno, the American comedian, often goes there in his retirement because that's where his career started. And it's called the Comedy and Magic Club, which shows you that comedy and magic belong together. They have comedians, they have magicians, they probably have some people who are both. And comedy, again, you can ruin by literalizing. So here's an example. The United Nations, or some group connected to the United Nations, did a humor survey across the planet some years ago. They had a list of 100 jokes, and they asked people in each country to rank their favorite jokes on the list. And none of them were that funny, but I thought the best one was Belgium's favorite joke. Canadians actually had the worst, I'm sorry to say, because I love Canada, but I despised their favorite joke, which I won't even repeat. But the Belgian one was all right. The Belgian one was, there are three kinds of people: those who can count and those who can't. Okay, it's not that funny, but let's say you heard that joke and you have a 5-year-old child who says, "Daddy, I don't get it." And you'd say, all right, well, see, the joke said there are three kinds of people, but then the person only said two kinds, which means they're inscribed in the joke themselves. They're one of the kind that can't count. And I asked myself, how can you ruin that joke? Well, one way to ruin it is to say there are two kinds of people: those who can count and those who can't. Okay, now you recognize that that's not a joke. That's kind of some banal remark. That it's hard to imagine a situation where that's a relevant remark. Maybe a frustrated shopkeeper is angry at an employee and one of them can't count. One of them can't do the cash register successfully and says, there are two kinds of people: those who can count and those who can't, disgustedly. How else can you do it? Well, let me switch to another joke that can be ruined in more ways. This joke is: a man goes into a shop in Chinatown in San Francisco, and he's looking around at all these items in there. And he says, how much is this brass rat? There's a brass rat. And the shopkeeper says, $10 for the brass rat, $10,000 for the story behind the rat. And the guy says, I don't want to pay $10,000. Just give me the rat for $10. So he buys it, walks out of the shop, and he notices rats are following him through the street. And so he gets nervous. He starts walking a little faster. More and more rats are coming out of the alleys and out of the holes. And so he starts running. And now thousands of rats are following him through the streets of San Francisco. He's really panicking. He's working up a sweat, running at top speed. Now there's 1 million rats coming after him. He runs down to Fisherman's Wharf and he finds a telephone pole, and he climbs up the pole really fast, and the rats still chew up the pole after him. So as a last resort, he takes the rat and throws it in the water. The rats all dive into the water after the rat and drown. So he goes back to the shop, and the owner is very smug, and he's smiling and says, I suppose you want to buy that story now, huh? And he says, no, I just want to know if you have any brass lawyers. All right. How can you ruin that joke? I could thought of at least 3 ways. One of them is he comes in at the end and says, no, I just want to know if you have any brass carpenters. Now, why would that be confusing? It would be confusing because nobody hates carpenters, right? It's a harmless profession. And not everybody hates lawyers either. It's just kind of a cultural cliche to say, oh, lawyers are ripping us all off. I don't know what it's like in Iran, but in the US, everyone's always complaining about lawyers ripping off everybody and manipulating the law for their own ends and things. Okay, so that's one way you could ruin it: change the lawyer to the carpenter. Another way you could ruin it is by over literalizing it and saying, In fact, I do have a brass lawyer. That'll be $10. And he buys the brass lawyer, goes back out of the shop. Lawyers start coming out of law firms, chasing him. More and more lawyers are coming out. By the end, thousands of lawyers from San Francisco are chasing the man until he throws the brass lawyer into the water and they all jump in and drown. Because what do you do with that, right? That's just implausible, not even science fiction, implausible magic realism, I guess, the drowning of the lawyers of San Francisco. But there's another way you can do it. You can ruin it. Notice that one of the secrets of that joke is its sudden unexpectedness. Where did these lawyers come from? They were not foreshadowed. You could ruin it by foreshadowing it. So imagine this joke. A man in San Francisco was going through a really bitter divorce. His wife hired the best divorce lawyer and destroyed him in court and got 90% of his income. He was really bitter about it. And then he goes into a shop and buys a brass rat, right? So now what ruins that as a joke? It's that it's reduced to this petty grudge this man holds against his wife's divorce lawyer, which is not very interesting. So only the suddenness of the joke makes it work. So in other words, jokes work in much the same way as a metaphorical statement would, or as a magic trick would, as anything non-literal would. And this is also why certain periods in the history of science are simply not as interesting as the revolutionary periods. If you go back and read quantum theory between 1900 and 1930, it's like a spy novel, a detective novel. It's exciting. There's new discoveries being made every week. And now it's just kind of people tinkering around the edges and proposing theories that have no experimental evidence. It's not, quantum theory isn't what it was. If you look instead today at astronomy, now there's a science that's very exciting because of the new telescopes, the new theories about exoplanets. You could say that astronomy is in a really ripe phase right now. And the same happens with art genres, right? And architectural styles. They have periods where they're fueling lots of new discoveries. They have other periods where they're becoming banal. Clement Greenberg, one of the great art critics, someone I really like, a formalist art critic, often talks about how people over-worship all phases of Picasso's career, when after about 1929, Picasso's really just copying himself. He's doing Picasso's shtick, right? He's not, whereas between, the blue period and the late 20s, everything he did was a masterpiece almost in conception and execution. But then people keep worshiping Picasso as an infallible genius. They worship all of his work even after he's kind of putting it out at industrial levels of quality and it no longer has the same edge that it had. And so what is it that distinguishes the right periods of any human endeavor? It's the period where the nature of the object is not quite sure, where the qualities belonging to the object are not quite exhausted, and where there's that tension that's driving people in different directions to opposite solutions. Whereas once too much is known about a thing, well, that's very useful in social and cognitive terms, but the excitement has gone from it, and the imaginative thinkers have moved on. So let's look at, for example, deconstructivist architecture and Deleuzian architecture. I think Marx part of a generation of architects that tired of those. And I think one of the reasons they were open to Triple O is that they were looking for any new way of conceptualizing problems. My interpretation, architects have always read philosophers, right? But architecture has been in a very close relationship with philosophers since mid-60s to the early 70s. And there was a Heidegger phase, a Derrida phase, and a Deleuze phase for about a generation apiece. Why did it start happening then? My take on it is that the end of modernism in architecture provoked a kind of crisis. And modernism is still around, but it's not an infallible discourse anymore, right? The idea that the form of a building should be expressive rather than decorative and these kinds of things. All the other features you see of modern architecture came into crisis, and there were different attempts to try to come to grips with that without just falling back into historical pastiche, which some people have accused Bob Stern and his colleagues of doing. I like looking at all about Bob Stern's stuff, but these critiques are made, right? And so that some people think the way to remain progressive in architecture has been to seek inspiration in certain philosophers. So with Heidegger, there's been a concern with human dwelling, but maybe too much of an anthropocentric concern. With Derrida, there was this concern with disruption and shock and surprise and sudden change. And then that kind of reversed in 1993 onward with this idea of smoothness and continuous variation and gradients and inability to distinguish between the building and its environment. And I think in many ways, since Triple O pushes back on some of those Deleuzian themes, that's one of the reasons it's been appealing to some architects of my generation and a bit younger. So now Mark did something interesting. I often contrasted him with Tom Wiscombe on this because Tom Wiscombe did some interesting things with the withdrawalness of the building, right? Where the building, the form of the building would be hidden behind a loose outer envelope. It would be raised above the ground. The surface tattoos of the building would be out of sync with its structural logic. And I think these are very effective techniques, but Mark did the other O thing that no one else has really picked up on, which is this, all the tensions are on the surface. There isn't something really withdrawn in Mark's buildings. He's not aiming at a sense of mystery so much. He's aiming at a kind of aesthetic complication that is there to meet the eye, but that the eye can't master. And he might reject that characterization. It's always dangerous to talk about other people's arts, but that's, in my book on Lovecraft, I talk about how Lovecraft's style has those two elements. One of the elements of Lovecraft's style is it would not be wholly inaccurate to say that Cthulhu combines a pulpy tentacled head with a vaguely humanoid outline and dragon-like wings. And yet there was something a bit more to it, something about the general outline of the whole. Or Lovecraft will say a sailor was swallowed up by an angle which was acute but behaved as if it were obtuse. So there's a difference between the object and its qualities that's quite overt. Whereas the other thing Lovecraft does, he talks about the Antarctic city reflected in the ice, in the clouds, where he says, oh, it's pretty easy to describe this crazy Antarctic city, and he gives like 25 of its qualities, but there's no way you can fit them together. There's such a crazy assembly of contrasting themes. And when I saw Mark's skyscraper design for the Upper West Side or Midwest Side, 50-something street, that's what I thought of as well. There was nothing really hidden and mysterious about it. It was simply an agglomeration of qualities that were very difficult to integrate, and for that reason required work on the beholder's part. How am I going to hold all this together? Because there's a nice sort of complexity here, nice sort of ornamentation. And that reminded me of two things. It reminded me of Cubism, where nothing is hidden. All of the planes are on the surface, and yet it's hard to performatively assimilate a Cubist painting. And the other is Husserl's philosophy, where you can see an object from 150 different sides, and none of those sides is the right side. So maybe I'll stop there and open it up for discussion. It's always a pleasure to talk with Mark, so I'm sure I'll have some surprises coming. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Graham, and thank you, Mark, for your amazing talks. If anybody has any questions, they can raise hand or write it in the comment section. Mark, do you have any comments, response to Graham's?
That's it. I mean, I took a lot of notes. It's interesting. I just had I had just had a conversation with David Chalmers for the next issue of Log, just talking about the nature of reality and consciousness, and he knows your work and says you write clear enough to be an analytical philosopher. So, but one thing that was interesting, I was looking through Vitruvius, and it says in the first book of the first chapter that architects should follow philosophers with intention. And it's interesting that, looking back over the last couple decades of philosophy's integration with architecture, that it's actually literally there in the first instruction manual on architecture from 2000 years ago, that there was an intuitive relationship between these two fields. And I just always thought that was, I really just came across it when I was doing research on why would I be talking to you or David Chalmers or anyone. And it's interesting because I think, in the same way you talk about Socrates and the love of wisdom versus having wisdom, it's almost like if you had wisdom, I think you would be a bad architect.
Sure. Mark, you got muted. Mark, you got muted.
I think something happened.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I just cut out for a second, but I was just going to say that if you have all the knowledge, you can't be interested in philosophy. If you have all the knowledge of architecture, you can't be interested in architecture. That it requires that kind of struggle.
Yes.
And I think my internet's dying, so I'll let you take over.
Yeah, Mark, it's interesting that you've been so open to philosophy, and of course, you're not alone in the architecture world in being so. The complaints I sometimes hear from the architecture world, there's kind of an anti-philosophical backlash that why are we always taking marching orders from philosophers and just producing literal folds on our building after Deleuze, or literal disruptions like Derrida. And I see that as philosophy's fault. Philosophy has not really been in a position to learn from architecture, not because they don't want to, but because they can't, because philosophy since Kant has really become almost exclusively about the single relation between thought and worlds. Philosophy has become almost unable to talk about the relationship between two non-human things. That's become the exclusive preserve of the natural sciences or of some other specialized fields. Philosophers are supposed to talk about this single place where thought meets worlds. How can thought know worlds? Can thought get outside of its own prison and make contact with the worlds? In one way or another, that's what philosophy does now, unless it's talking about science and deferring obsequiously to the sciences. My aspiration as a philosopher involved in architecture, I think I can do something that Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze never did, which is that I think I can learn from architecture more than they did. If you look at the works of Heidegger, Derrida, and Deleuze, Heidegger wrote that nice article, Building Dwelling Thinking, that's inspired architects, but it doesn't show much knowledge of architecture. Derrida, I think his low point was in his exchange of open letters with Peter Eisenman. I disagree with Peter Eisenman about a lot, but I totally take his side in that correspondence, because Derrida is basically just scolding him for misinterpreting what Cora means, or misinterpreting what different philosophical terms mean, over literalizing them. And I think Eisenman's response is perfect. It's that I have to make stuff that stands up and doesn't collapse and kill people. So I can't play all these games with words like you do. And I think that's one of Derrida's weaknesses, and Eisenman hits it better than any philosophers do. And then in Deleuze's case, I just don't know. I mean, he became picked up by architects only a few years before his death, and I don't know to what extent he even interacted with architects. Probably less than Heidegger and Derrida, yeah. So one thing I'm in a position to do that none of these guys were in a position to do is I'm in an architecture school. I talk to architects. I have a great architectural library at my disposal. And so architectural problems are constantly making me think philosophically, just by hearing architectural discourse all the time. And I hope you've seen a little bit of that in my book, Architecture and Objects, but I hope you're going to see more of that, because my career as an architectural writer is not closed. I've been here 8 years. I might retire here for all I know. And what is it about architects? Well, first of all, architects are dealing with concrete problems that they have to solve in a way that philosophers aren't. Architects deal with all kinds of constraints that philosophers don't, like budgets, like competition committees, like historical fact. Mark, I've seen the incredible historical research you've done for some of your competition entries. You've sent some of it to me before, I think. And most philosophers don't bother to do that. And so learning to wrestle with constraints is a kind of realism that philosophers need more of. In fact, when I wrote the quadruple object, I wrote in the forward preface, not jokingly, that I saw myself as an architect when writing this book, because I had constraints. The constraint was I was only able to get a certain grant amount from my university in Egypt. I think it was $5,000 at the time. And in France, there's a certain set amount that you have to pay translators. You can't pay less, I believe. And so I had to figure out how many words can I write and still afford to pay the translator with a $5,000 grant. So I had a definite number of words that were limited. And then I arbitrarily decided to divide those words into 10 chapters. And so then I had a definite constraints. What should I say in each chapter, and how many words can I devote to each chapter? And then in the end, there was one thing that I thought I didn't develop enough. And so the translator agreed to let me add 500 extra words for free or something. So I just added that. And it was a very interesting experience, right? Because then I could work a little more like I imagine an architect does. I didn't have a staff, but I had a certain time budget as well. I had to get it done by a certain date. And so I knew how many hours I had to put on in a week. I knew which things should be said in which chapters, and it really helped. And philosophers don't like doing that because they like preserving a bit of the artist's unfettered freedom cliche. Architects already don't have that. Right? Architects already have to interact with people. And in a way, I've often felt bad for them, because it's like being a filmmaker. There's certain things you can't do without budgets, whereas I don't need a budget. I can be poor and still do my work. And that's an advantage philosophers have. You just need a publisher to take an interest. But in a way, it's also a positive influence on architects. The fact that they have to struggle with these worldly factors. And maybe they have to make compromises sometimes, and maybe those compromises give the work more impact because there are other social forces channeling them in certain directions they might not have wanted to do in the drafting studio. So I like to write books with constraints. I like to find constraints for myself if they don't already exist.
Yeah, I don't think it's just philosophers. I think even my conversations with architects have been more fruitful than talking to artists, because in architecture, I think there's a sense that you have to be a realist. You have to take into account the outside reality, where as opposed to like in arts, everything is simply like subjective. Apparently, like why you painted this subject, why does it look like it? Like, I felt like it should be look like this. There is no like I don't know, like I don't know, concrete framework. And sometimes it doesn't feel like you have common grounds with artists to talk about, as opposed to like in architecture, they have something to say, and also it's way more fruitful. I do have some questions, however, from both of you, and I have a couple of questions from I have a couple of questions from each of you, and a couple of questions for both. Just speaking about quadrupole objects, I want to ask you, Graham, that how is space defined in the language of OO, and how do various interactions manifest within it? Is the space considered a container for interactions, or is it regarded as a result arising from interplay between human and non-human entities?
Very good. And I sense some Henri Lefebvre in the background of this question. Historically, the great controversy over space is in the Leibniz-Clarke correspondence in the early 1700s, shortly before Leibniz's death. Samuel Clarke was representing Newton. In fact, he was probably going over and getting whispers in the ear from Newton during this conversation, because Newton and Leibniz were great enemies, at least in Newton's eyes. And Newton, of course, thought that time and space were eternal and empty containers that things happen inside of. Leibniz, the opposite, through such famous arguments as this. Could we say that what if the universe was created 10 meters further to the west? Leibniz says that would be a nonsensical question, because 10 meters further to the west compared to what? So you can't think of space and time in absolute terms. Could God have created the universe 10 years earlier than he did? What does that mean? It means nothing. There was no time until the universe was created. So these are, these are Leibniz's arguments. Now, Newton actually won the day at the time. Leibniz came back triumphant in the period of Einstein, because for Einstein, of course, time and space are not absolute. They are bent by mass, distorted by mass. So Tripolo is on Leibniz's side there, and also, interestingly, on Lefebvre's side, on his Marxist side. Let me say something a little general about Marxism here first, before I get into Lefebvre. There's been a resurgence of influence in Marxism over the last 20 years or so, obviously, in intellectual circles. It's regained a kind of hegemony that it lost during the long, cold winter of deconstruction. Marx is a very powerful social analyst, obviously, but I don't consider myself a Marxist. Why not? Well, partly for the reason that I don't consider myself a modernist at all. What are the left and the rights politically? People position themselves somewhere on the spectrum of left and right politically. That only goes back to the French Revolution. It's not very old. This idea that it goes back to the two sides of the assembly during the French Revolution, the more radical people on the left side, the more conservative people on the right. And the left and the right, I've written a book about this, basically boil down to two different theories of human nature. If you think that humans are naturally good and free, and that we are unhappy because of oppressive classes or society has corrupted us, then you're on the side of Rousseau or Marx, you're on the side of the left. It's based on a theory of human nature, that things should be a lot better than they are, but certain people are taking advantage and exploiting and oppressing. All right. If instead you think humans are naturally dangerous, humans are naturally murderers, rapists, and robbers, and we need maximum authority to hold them in check, we need to worry mostly about crime, we need very strong police, we need very strong armies, because of the jungle of international relations, then you're on the right. You're viewing humans as a dangerous animal the way Hobbes does, or Carl Schmitt or Machiavelli. Okay, so what's wrong with both of these sides? It's not that they're both too extreme and we need to meet in the middle, because the middle is just another form of modernism. The problem is that both of them base their political theory on human nature. And human nature is not necessarily the most important thing in political theory. We also deal with the world. Here's an example. One thing the left doesn't like talking about as much is the force of objects and the force of geography, because the left likes to imagine humans as having free will to invent their own political systems and to experiment, and to and the idea that geography affects history, or that certain objects affect history, as with Marshall McLuhan, these are seen as conservative because they're seen as constraints on human free will. I think that's a fundamental misreading of what geography and objects are about. Let me speak for a minute of David Graeber and David Wengrow's best-selling book, The Dawn of Everything: A New History of Humanity. Because what's interesting about that book, they're leftists, they're anarchists, they're anti-capitalist anarchists, and Graeber unfortunately died a few years ago, one of our more interesting intellectuals. What they begin their book with the same point I just did. They said, we're stuck in this seesawing between Rousseau and Hobbes, and it's very boring. Everyone either thinks we used to live in these wonderful small hunter-gatherer societies that were destroyed by architecture, or they think humans are dangerous and we need to use force to punish criminals and enemies severely. But what's their alternative? They say their alternative is that humans are neither dangerous nor happy. Humans are imaginative. Humans can experiment with dictatorships, and humans can experiment with festivals and egalitarian governments, and humans can experiment with women running everything at different seasonal times of year. And that's more interesting in the Hobbesian or Rousseauian picture. But you'll notice that they both still put humans at the center. It's just that humans aren't evil or good. Humans are imaginative. Again, humans are at the center. This is why I prefer Bruno Latour's approach, where it's inanimate objects that stabilize the human space and that push back on our efforts. So certain kinds of parts of the world are going to be suited to monocultures. Right? Saudi Arabia has a lot of oil in an era when oil is the most prized commodity. I said bribed, what a Freudian slip. Prized commodity on earth. Well, that means Saudi Arabia is devoted to a monoculture, basically one item economy, at least until recently, and those economies tend to be very conservative and very hierarchical. So it's not so surprising that Saudi Arabia had a very hierarchical kingdom. Until recently, they seem to be trying to reform it, based on my recent visit there, and try to diversify the economy a bit. Or other countries that have one product, cotton in the American South, right? It's not surprising that they developed a more hierarchical and reactionary economy with slaves in the American South than they did in the North. Or Marshall McLuhan talking about how television changed the world, or the way we can talk about how Twitter paved the way for Donald Trump to be elected president by creating an ocean of disinformation where people didn't know what was right or wrong anymore. All right, so these are some of my problems with Marxism. Well, the reason I'm not a Marxist, that, and also the fact that I'm not entirely convinced that that surplus value means someone's being exploited. I can see the argument, but I'm not quite convinced by it. That said, I think highly of Henri Lefebvre's production of space. Certainly, I agree with him that space is not an empty container, that space is produced. It's also a work, right? Lefebvre has this distinction between the work and the product, which sounds kind of like the praxis poiesis distinction that Hannah Arendt talks about and that Heidegger talks about, that praxis is something you're doing where the activity itself is what's important, and the product is where you create a freestanding thing that simply exchange. It becomes subject to the commodity fetishism and exchange value. So, the work is essentially better for Marxists than the product, but he still treats product positively in his book. And I agree, you have to do a deep dive on space historically and conceptually to understand what's going on. You can't say there's a certain amount of Euclidean space in Los Angeles, how is it filled? You have to start looking at how that space has changed over time. And somebody made an interesting remark when I was at the American University in Cairo, which is that all of these new private universities were springing up in Egypt, like the German university in Cairo and the Japanese university in Cairo. And a lot of us were really panicking about these, right? These are going to be cheaper than the American university, and they're going to be offering certain majors we don't. One of my colleagues made a remark that turned out to be very wise, which is that he said, you have to understand that universities evolve over time. You can't just decree a university and it's going to be a great university overnight by hiring a bunch of people. A university develops its own internal dialogues, it develops its own programs, it develops histories. And so being an old university is actually inherently a good thing. So if you have Oxford or Paris or Bologna, these have an automatic advantage just for being old. And I think that reminded me of Lefebvre about space, because when spaces are developed, they build up a historical texture that, sure, may be harder for capital to colonize because there's certain points of resistance historically already there. For instance, some people see Islam, pre-existent Islam in certain countries, as a node of resistance to capital, if that's what they're trying to do. And there may be good and bad aspects to that. Or in certain countries, there may be certain traditions that make it hard for capital to colonize certain parts of the society. So history can sometimes be your ally there. Also, there's the fact that puzzled many that the first revolution was in Russia when it should have been in England or Germany, right? And that what was it about the historical conditions of Russia that led to the first revolution? Well, you can see some very oppressive conditions under the Tsar and other things that made Russia the seedbed of the likely revolution. Palestine, the cause of Palestine has been adopted as part of the anti-capitalist struggle for various reasons, and not surprising reasons. So I have mostly positive things to say about Lefebvre, and there's not a lot that I would say that I reject in his conception of space, except that I'm always very suspicious of talking about bourgeois this or that, or about commodities. Because I think there's a lot of confusion. A lot of Marxists confuse Tripolo of commodity fetishism. And if you go read Marx's Das Kapital, commodity fetishism is the first thing he talks about. So it's right at the beginning. You don't have to get too far into the book. And what you find is that a lot of people assume that if you believe in anything independent of society, that's commodity fetishism. But that's not what it's about. What it's about is that if you believe in the value of anything apart from society, that's commodity fetishism. So if I say my coat has an objective value, that's commodity fetishism, because I'm forgetting all the social relations with the third world, with workers in Cambodia being paid starvation wages, making my coat, and then it coming over here and being marked up. That's what Marxism doesn't want us to forget. But Marx himself talks about things that aren't commodities. Marx himself says that air and water are not yet commodities. That if you have to give 10% of your corn to the duke, who is your feudal lord, that's not a commodity. Bartering is not commodity. If you're trading with people, that's not commodity. So it's not like Marx has a relationist ontology that would oppose Tripolo. Marx has a relationist theory of value, and Tripolo hasn't really developed a theory of value. So there's nothing there that would oppose me. But I think Marxists tend to see fetishism in places where they shouldn't see it, and I get notes of that from Lefebvre. But he's a very fresh thinker in terms of Marxism. He's not dogmatic like many are. He makes you think, you keep your eyes open on every page. And I do like a lot of what he has to say about space. Sorry if that was too long an answer.
That was great. My next question is for Mark, which is kind of related to my previous question. So I want you to talk about that sentence. They asked me to remove it, Mark. I wrote in this statement that architecture has become a tool for the state to shape and reshape relations within a space and therefore force its narrative. In which you responded, it's a very old critique of aesthetics, actually, and I think while it may have been true in the past, architecture plays a far smaller role in these activities than it has in the past. So I would like to understand your perspective on how both architecture and the arts can contribute to the redistribution of the sensible. Additionally, could you elaborate on the distinction between a contemporary interpretation of aesthetics and one rooted in the past? Thank you.
Well, to the first, if my sound cuts out, which it is doing, just point to your ear and I'll wait a second and it'll come back. Yeah, I think there's this embedded idea certainly in architecture schools that thinking about aesthetics is in some way, aesthetics are the tool of authority, that aesthetics are the tool of power to keep, I don't know, humans docile, and certainly that was the case in the past. I mean, the Catholic Church in medieval France, completely overwhelmed the sensibilities of medieval villagers by having these incredible cathedrals, which seemed like they couldn't have been built by anyone other than God. But I think there's so many other ways to communicate today that architecture has very little skin in that game anymore. I mean, Putin is controlling Russia, but not through architecture. That the relationship between architecture and power is far less significant than it has been in the past. I mean, historically, leaders maybe emphasize their power through architecture, but I don't really know that there's any real relationship between architecture of authority and the kind of oppression that may have come with that in the past. Maybe Napoleon III was the last to really use architecture as a tool of authority, but there's just much better tools. I mean, like Graham was saying with Twitter and Donald Trump and all that, like architecture historically has been a tool for communication, but there's so many better tools for communication now that if a kind of tyrant is using architecture, they're not going to get very far as a tyrant, in my opinion.
All right.
Can I add a comment?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Jane Bennett has made a good point about this, and I suppose Marxists would call Bennett a bourgeois delusion, but the point she makes is that she was watching a Levi's commercial where people were doing swing dancing in the commercial on TV. And of course, an easy Marxist analysis would be commodity fetishism. They're trying to spread this commodity. But she said, yes, that's true. But it's also true that the force of the dancing kind of burst out from the commercial and was very infectious and created a kind of liveliness that goes beyond anything Levi's jeans is trying to do with it to sell commodities. So things often escape whatever you think capitalism is trying to do with them. That would be my reaction.
All right.
And the flip side of that is one that worries me when we're speaking about commodities is that my worry now is that architecture becomes a commodity, that it's something like a dentist. It doesn't really matter which dentist you go to, you're going to get your teeth cleaned. And I think architecture is heading down that path where there's so few architects who are doing work that's different than other architects that at a certain point it might not matter. And in that sense, maybe that makes what I'm doing, more of an act of connoisseurship or expertise. But that's my worry, not only with the development of like building information technologies, where there's only so many things you can do in a BIM program that it doesn't really matter who does them, and you're going to get a building and you're going to be able to keep people hot or cold or park or whatever. And that architecture just ceases to be part of the creative landscape of humanity, which, if you look at the 20th century city, may have already happened.
As my last question, because I don't want to take so much time from any of you. So my question is that how can the realism of object-oriented ontology beacon us into an uncertain future, potentially creating change in the current system by establishing new spaces with new sets of relations in a society like Iran? I know you've never been here, but I would appreciate your speculations.
Well, I often think of what could Iran do for us instead, because here you have one of the great countries in the history of philosophy and poetry that's drifted out of the world orbit. And I often think of how amazing would it be to have philosophy conferences in Iran with the great tradition you have, or to have Persian poetry sweeping over the world again. I guess we have Rumi, who lived in modern Turkey, wrote in Persian, right? Who's the world's best-selling poet, but there's others. And so I often think about it as what we are missing by not having Iran accessible to us. As for realism, I think realism is always a good idea because it's, again, constraints. It's the way of grounding your human activity in something that works, something that's real, something that actually has an impact. And the importance of realism and aesthetics for O is that aesthetics requires a real performance on the part of the human who observes it, whereas literal statements allow for a detachment and alienation. Aesthetics requires enchantment, requires us to become embedded in the world and take a stand on it. And aesthetics may not have a direct impact on feeding the hungry masses or liberating the oppressed, but it can rearrange the map of the world. I'm thinking of the Middle East differently, Mark, now that I saw your resorts. And I know some opponents of yours might snicker and guffaw at that, but I just had a new experience of what that part of the world could look like based on what you've done with it, stuff that's completely unprecedented in my experience of looking at that neighborhood. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my great, I don't know, one of many disappointments that I've experienced in the last 20 years is that I traveled a lot when I was younger in college, and I've had the opportunity, as Graham has, that, you know, frequently we lecture in other parts of the world. And I've just noticed that the places that I went in the 90s and that I've gone back to have become totally westernized. The kind of exotic sense I had going to a place like Istanbul in 1995 is very different than going to Istanbul in 2020.
Right.
And there's a kind of, I mean, you think of American democracy was something in 1776, and then in Armenian terms, it kind of fused with capitalism, and it's a very different thing in 2020 than it was in 1776. Like, and in a sense, I think all politics become fusions of different things. My worry is that the kind of Western capitalism is just smudging over the entire earth, you know? So I always, you know, think about it in terms of a Coke, like where can you go on earth and not get a Diet Coke? Can you get a Diet Coke in Iran?
Oh
The
yeah.
only place I've, yeah.
Yes,
So
of
the only
course.
place I've ever been, I couldn't get a Diet Coke was North Korea. And that says something about the absence of difference in human cultures right now. And what happens if we have a world where there's no spaces that are different than any other spaces? And to that extent, I think the cultures with the strongest, maybe non-Western traditions of civilization, including the Persian or the, you know, other civilizations in that area, or even what I've learned of the Nabateans, which were, you know, they were coincident with the Romans. And I never knew anything about the Nabateans, but I know everything about the Romans. I lived in Rome for a year, and there's something, I don't know, I think really important about that foreign material, that non-Western material, that aspects of other civilizations that can protect us from a homogenous world. And I look to, you know, the projects that I'm involved in, the way that I don't know, it's capitalism. I'm doing a resort. Resorts are for wealthy people, you know, but it's the way they're developing that part of the world. It's not like they would do it here, where you would sell off, you know, parcels and let developers develop everything. And but because there's a different political structure, they're able to do things with much more control and much more thought, actually, and not kind of release the hounds of capitalism and destroy the entire natural habitat on which those resorts exist. And to that extent, I think I don't know how to fix the problems that exist in Iran because I'm not familiar with the problem. I mean, I'm vaguely familiar with the problems of Iran, but I think that there's these hidden histories in civilizations and these aspects of these hidden histories and hidden aspects of ways that people live that are probably going to refuse with what we have in interesting new ways. And I kind of hope they do it differently in different aspects of the world. So in a way, I kind of think a lot of civilizations and parts of the world have these latent goodies, which may have been asleep for a while and may be reawakened, you know. I mean, I only know of Iran what I've heard about it from the 60s and 70s, and but this vibrant place of cultural exchange and like, you know, very much part of a kind of contemporary scientific worldview. And, I don't know, what is there from Iran that can change the way we think about contemporary capitalism, as opposed to like, how does contemporary capitalism like open up Iran? So I'm interested in the difference. I think I'm most interested in the difference that aspects of civilization bring to the world, to avoid a kind of homogeneity where everywhere you go, you have the same Marriott and the same Starbucks and the same clothing stores. That I'm like yearning for difference and finding less and less of it everywhere I go.
Mhm.
So the thing that makes you different may be bad in some scenarios, but it may also have hidden things that are incredibly valuable in the future. And I hope we don't lose those as everything gets smoothed over with this kind of capitalist Westernism, Western view of everything.
Yeah. Well, I would say do not forget that the Iranian Revolution in 1979 started with this core concept that Iranian theorists created and coined, which was Vestoxification, which
Mm.
was this pure hatred toward Westerners.
Mhm.
And look where we are right now,
Yeah.
you know? So I would say I don't vouch for, I'm not like, I would say like non-Eurocentrism means like anti-Eurocentrism. So I don't vouch for this way of like hatred toward even like white people. I think
Mhm.
I don't know. I would like to embrace any like the differences, and I would enjoy to see fusions, as you said, between Persian culture and different cultures around the world. Why not? You can see all these like hybrid objects instead of
Yeah.
like just simply refusing each other because of our I don't know, like cultural differences. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. Human, you have a question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Graham. I really appreciate the uh, talks that we have here and the push that you both are somehow inviting us to for the imagination. I had I had a lot of questions that I skipped, but now that we reached to the point of talking about sociocultural aspects, I am curious. First, I want to sort of build on top of that argument to just clarify how I am reading the conversation. uh, I had some keywords along the conversation, and I really like the way that you two are somehow fitting with each other in a way to have both the visual part and how the realization of this idea of triple O is possible, and at the same time the philosophical and theoretical argument that we have parallel to each other. What I got was about the talk that Graham was sharing with us. The role of speech art, the magic trick, and the moment surprise. My reading of that argument, to maybe push it a little bit to the extreme, I'm not sure, is that the role of architect as a comedian can be important here, because we were also talking about the metaphors and the way that how this kind of literally and at the same time imaginary argument or conversation can be like the way of communication in here. And then that's the reason that I'm pushing for this idea, is that because I think that that cultural aspect is also involved, and I would like to raise this question that to me it's always a kind of curiosity to understand how this cultural aspect can be merged with this idea of triple O. Because, for example, when I'm looking at the examples that the projects that Foster Gage is sharing with us, and I see one aspect just as an example of the materiality. Uh, I would say that there are different interpretations of that materiality in different parts of the world. For example, the role of gold in or metal materials are differently interpreted in different parts of the world. And I want to know that, because that's I would say, a serious part of this aesthetic universe or way of looking at the world that we are talking about. And I want to know, is there any way that, what is the position here about thinking about that aspect? Because I think you were also talking about the interpretation or perception, and also the active role of the audience to participate in understanding the metaphor. And I see there is a lot of historical, cultural, political background behind those interpretations. For example, for us as Iranians, it's a really different way of understanding what is materiality, what is Roman architecture, for instance. What is, because of those, part of it is because of those constructions which have been done during the history, specifically I would say before revolution, and those constructs are already like dragging us into a different uh, channel to understand the world, which is obvious for everyone else in the world, that those, let's say personal backgrounds and collective moments of different societies are always an attachment to understand what does that object mean, what is the aesthetic of that object. And I would like to know your opinion about that. Is there any thought for that or something?
Funny, Graham was talking earlier about the, the kind of freedom of philosophy and the kind of constraints found in architecture, but you could also make the reverse case and say that in order to be a successful philosopher, you need to have like kind of series of ideas that relate and support one another, and you have to construct an argument. And at least if you're in a certain type of philosopher, you have to outline those arguments, maybe more like an analytic philosopher would, as a kind of logic. There's a certain logic to it. And if you don't logically support your arguments, you're probably not going to make it very far as a philosopher. Unless I guess you're really obscure at writing, which there have been some philosophers that you cannot decipher whatsoever, and they still manage to make a certain amount of success. But I don't know. I think one of the things I appreciate more about architecture is that there are certain inputs. I can read about a culture, I can look at some images, I can be inspired by things, I can meet with 1,000 people, I can study the program, I can study the zoning, I can learn about sustainability. And I kind of put this stuff in my head, and something comes out. And even why that thing comes out is withdrawn from me. Like, I don't know why. I mean, I made some of those things spires, or some of them brass, or some of them gold. I just did. And I don't really have maybe a good answer to describe like the meaning behind a lot of that. And I think that's actually maybe one of architecture's forgotten powers, is that it's one of those few disciplines that you can put stuff in and get something out and not need to have a one-to-one relationship. Like, it just allows you to make this hugely human, intuitive leap that you don't even have access to consciously, and you spit it out, and sometimes it just becomes magic. And if you try to figure out why it's magic, it loses its magic. So I don't know. I mean, I know I was looking at a lot of those types of metals, and I could say that it symbolizes this or that, or it's the way the Nabateans use metal, but really it would be a bunch of bullshit. I don't really know why those buildings came out that way. They just kind of did. I hope you like them. That's kind of my attitude towards things these days. And for me, it's much more interesting for me to find out why people do or not like them, rather than tell you, well, it symbolizes a bird, you're supposed to see a bird. Birds are about peace, and I want peace with Iran, and therefore my building's an offer of peace. So really, the open-endedness and the weirdness of the human design process is, I don't know, something I'm more comfortable celebrating than I have been before. I don't have reasons. I could make them up, they wouldn't be very good, but really I just did it because that's what came out.
Thank you very much.
My addition to that would be to say that the materials, I work in philosophy, not only reality itself, but also the history of philosophy. And I'd like to do that in an opposite direction from Deleuze, who has been the most influential recently. Deleuze likes to stay away from the major thinkers and work on what he calls the minor tradition, Hume and Spinoza and the Epicureans. I think that's an overreaction that Deleuze had to make in the context of French academic theory, where classicism reigns supreme. And what it did is it conceded to all the old academic mandarins the right to interpret the big thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas and Hegel Whereas, you know, and a lot of Americans imitate that, but in America, we're in a totally different situation. The idea that we have an excess of classicism in America is laughable. And so I prefer instead to go back to Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas and Hegel, the big ones, and simply read them in a different way than they've ever been read before. So that's my reaction to materialism. If you go through Aristotle, for example, he's really weird. He's considered the most boring establishment philosopher, but that's only because he became that in the late Middle Ages. You know, originally he was very adventurous because he was this guy read by Muslims in Andalusia. And so it was kind of a risque thing for Christians in France to read. But then he became kind of the establishment thinker par excellence. But he's really a very strange person who says strange things. And that's been my ticket back into anchoring myself in the classical materials, the weird Aristotle.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. Thank you, Mark. I know that we can go on and on, but I think that's a great point that we can end this amazing discussion. Thank you so much, Graham, for your participation and being with us. And thank you so much, Mark. I'm so glad that I was familiarized. I was familiar with your work and yourself through your book. And thank you so much for sharing your time with all of us. Anybody?
Pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much. It was enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks everyone for participating, and have a great day and night. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Graham. Good to see you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.